the talk I'm going to give today is a derived from a seminar that I give at UDALI. So I've got 8 hours worth of material here. I hope your seats are comfortable, and we'll see how we go. As Donna said, we've heard all about the regular stuff about how we've involved the automotive industry here in Dayton. So I thought I'd take some stories that are a little off the beaten path, see if we find some of them interesting. And the first thing I wanted to do is talk about how far back the automobile goes in the Dayton area. For the best I can tell, well, this might have been the first automobile in the Dayton area. It was designed by two gentlemen out of Springfield. It's just a three-wheeled steam-powered cart. It's kind of hard to tell how they controlled it. Not much information. They claim they had a top speed of 25 miles an hour, and I kind of doubt that. I doubt that really that they actually got to test it. But the first ride of this car, if we want to call it that, was on Thanksgiving Day in 1886. But that's not all that happened that day. The second thing that happened is that, pardon me, there we go. The first traffic accident occurred in Springfield on Thanksgiving Day in 1886. As they were driving through the streets of Springfield, they lost control of the contraption, drove it into a storefront, kind of got it back together and thought, well, that's enough driving for the day. So they took it back to Russell's barn, and that was the end of the car because the car started a fire in the barn on Thanksgiving Day, and it was burned up. Yeah, yeah. You have to have a sense of humor when you're in the automotive industry, and so we'll go on from that. This next car, it's kind of hard to see, and I apologize for it. I stole this picture from one of the books that Kurt Dalton has written over out of Dayton history. But this is was a steam powered car as well. Had two seats, one in the front, one in the back. And the Henry Tuma took it back and used it in this farm on Frederick Pike for quite a while. And it was quite successful as far as he was concerned, but the neighbors really didn't like it. It was a steam engine, and it takes a lot of makes a lot of noise. Now we'll keep it here. So he finally had to put a gasoline engine on it, but he actually used that thing on his farm into the 1920s. So it had a life, a little bit longer than the first one. But there were companies that really wanted to build cars and gave it a try to build commercial or production cars dating back to 1895. You can see, however, that they didn't have a lot of life then either. The market was a little thin. There weren't any roads. There wasn't much to do, and they were confounded expensive things when you consider what it took to put them together. Just to point a couple out, the Boer car is actually the first car to make a lap of the Montgomery Fairgrounds. So it worked. The Custer was actually a small, almost a pedal car, had a little tiny engine in it that he had built for his 11-year-old son. They have that at Dayton history in the automotive or sales display, and it's kind of fun to go back and look at those as you go through this. By 1900, everybody got the bug, and that's just in the Miami Valley area. This isn't every one of these got to the point where they had a design. Some actually built cars, some didn't. We're going to talk specifically about a few of these as we go through. Like I say, I got 8 hours worth of material, but I did try and cut it down, so we won't talk about all of them. First one I want to talk about is the Victor automobile from 1903. Two gentlemen, Christian Weinman and Edward Eukenhofer, founded a company in 1882 as just a novelty manufacturer. But it was pretty successful. And from there, they built it into a gas engine company. And they built gasoline engines for, I can never remember the terms, basically farm equipment and static engines that were going to drive machines and things like that. By 1980 or 1896, they sold that company and opened a machine shop. Obviously, Weinman and Eukenhofer. I did this one because I just enjoy saying Eukenhofer. And Eukenhofer announced plans to build what he called the Victor automobile. He never did build it. He kind of got distracted by some other interests. He developed an automatic tagging device for attaching prices to merchandise. And you might be familiar with the name of the company. He founded Monarch Marking Systems. And the Victor card disappeared into the ether. This is one of my favorite stories, the Republic Motor Cars. It was founded in 1910 by George Adam Rentschler. Rentschler was an industrialist out of Hamilton, was quite successful. And he actually was responsible for building the tallest building in Hamilton, which is still the tallest building in Hamilton. It's an 8-story building in town. He had a variety of cars. He actually did get into production. And as we say here, he was one of the first cars to actually bother to put doors on for both the front and the back seats on the car. Usually you'll see the front seat didn't have a door. That was for the chauffeur. If he fell out, apparently that wasn't anybody's problem. But they were expensive. They used high-end materials. They grew to a price of about $2,250 for a car when a Model T went for $500, and so it was a big stretch. And by 1916, materials and demand for support for World War I came in and kind of took the market away, and they shut down. But one of Rentschler's sons was friends with the Wright brothers. And I didn't have time to put the video up here, but they have an interview of Rentschler's grandson talking about this flight. They decided to have a race from Hamilton to the fairgrounds here in Montgomery County. Rentschler got in his car at the town square in Hamilton, and then the Wright apparently flew over. It was a pretty close race until just before the end, and apparently Orville, who I think was flying the plane at the time, pushed the throttle forward a little bit, and he won the race by a few seconds. But it was just kind of a fun little thing to show that sometimes it works. Tesla is not the first electric car. The Baker Dayton Electric Car Company built a little tiny. It was basically a box with 4 wheels, and it was considered, though, to be the ideal car for women because you didn't have to crank start it. You could just get in and drive it, or get in, get it started, turn it on, and go. So it was a pretty popular car, or cars like it, for city driving and for that sort of thing. And of course, you had to go high end to get on the materials on this, with all of the broadcloth interiors and beveled glass windows, and the steering wheel actually folded back so that you could get into the car. Because I said it's a little tiny box. He started building 3 of these, and one of them made it to the street. I think there were some more, because if you go on YouTube, you can see a video of Jay Leno driving his Dayton or Baker Dayton electric car. So it still runs. This is an interesting guy. Charles R. Patterson was born as a slave in 1833. And while he was enslaved, he learned blacksmithing skills and coach building skills. And so by 1873, he actually formed a partnership with a white man and became eventually the sole proprietor of the company that he named C.R. Patterson and Sons in 1893. He recognized the potential of the horseless carriages and the cars, and he started building production cars in 1915. He still is the first and only sole proprietor and operator of an automobile company, black sole proprietor of an automobile company. His business moved away from cars, mostly went into funeral vehicles, hearses, ambulances, and things like that. And he was pretty successful with it for quite some time. Talking about funeral vehicles, the Meteor automotive company wound up out of Piqua. Started in Indiana, bought by a man from Minneapolis. He moved it to Piqua in the tens or teens of 19 teens. By 1914, he offered 2 models, and next year 4 models were available. And he also saw that there was a market for providing chassis for ambulances and hearses and that sort of thing. But he outsourced the bodies from another company up in Bellefontaine, and he did, again, quite well with it. As a matter of fact, as you drive to Richmond today, you remember the school bus factory on I-70? Well, that was the Meteor factory at the time. So it was quite a deal. Probably one of the most famous cars that they provided, you might recognize. This one's been slightly modified, but that is a Meteor body on a Cadillac chassis, and was built there in the Richmond area. Now, a lot of those manufacturers are people and companies that we're really not familiar with. I had no idea what those were until I started putting this thing together. But well, here we go. We don't need that. Pardon me here. I went off. Okay. There we go. Yeah. But now we're going to talk about some cars that we are probably more familiar with. The Speedwell Motor Car Company, started by a man named Pierce Davies Shank. Really wasn't interested so much in cars to begin with. He joined Dayton Malleable Iron in 1902 and wound up the president of the company. He was interested in trying to get materials in and out of the factory. And so he started looking at motorized vehicles in order to do that, build trucks and that sort of thing. But it evolved, as things usually do, into production cars. This is a picture of a Speedwell car that he started building in 1906. He built it in a barn. That might sound familiar to us, but it wasn't the same barn. And it was so successful a design, he was able to get investors and incorporated the company in 1907. Had a large range of body styles that were designed by a gentleman named Gilbert Loomis. Loomis had built his own cars in Massachusetts, but he got lured to Dayton by Speedwell, offered 4- and 6-cylinder engines, sourced from a company called Rutenberg Engine Company in Indiana. But he found that outsourced engines were really expensive, and so he decided to develop his own. And by 1910, he had an in-house produced engine. In 1909, the Speedwell base price was $2,500, which would be equivalent to $87,000 today. So cars still aren't cheap as we go forward. But he said it would be folly to pay more for a car, but it would be unwise to pay less. He kind of got distracted as well by other things, and so he left the company about 1912, 1913. And when he left, a gentleman named Cyrus Mead of Mead Engine Company stepped in to help finance the company. Mead had developed an engine that used rotating valves instead of poppet valves for their intake and exhaust system. It was kind of controversial because everybody was really comfortable with a rotating valve or a poppet valve. But he finally convinced the board to let him put his rotating valves on their 6-cylinder engines, and they put poppet valves on their 4-cylinder engines. As it turned out, the rotating valves really didn't work very well, and they had some issues with it. He broke away. He started trying to fix the problems with the rotating valve, and while they're doing that, though, between 1907 and 14, they actually built and delivered 4,000 cars. So that's a lot of cars for that time. But unfortunately, Mead died before he had this problem solved with the rotating valve. They went back to poppets, but then they were really, really affected by the 1913 flood, and it pretty much wiped them out. And they just were never able to recover from that. Probably the most well-known of the cars from Dayton is the Stoddard Dayton. John William Stoddard and John Dodds partnered in 1869 to manufacture horse-drawn hay rakes. That's what that is. So when you harvest your hay, you got to rake it up into a bale, and that's what this was for. And they were considered to be one of the best hay rakes to buy. They started to expand. Stoddard bought Dodds out in 1875, and he started to issue stock in what became the Stoddard Manufacturing Company. And it evolved to additional products on the farm industry. And later he expanded into bicycles like everyone else in Dayton. It was an interesting design. In 1904, Stoddard announced auto production. They built 125 cars in 1905, and it built up to 2,000 cars in 1907. So it was, again, they were moving things quite well. As a matter of fact, in 1907, it was second only to Barney and Smith as the number one employer in Dayton. The picture there is a picture of their factories along Bainbridge and McDonough and Bacon Streets. Stoddard was expensive too, and so they knew they needed to come up with something a little bit less expensive. And they spun off a company, a subsidiary in 1909 called the Courier Car Company. It was initially three models. One was a 4-cylinder car with a two-seater gas tank in the back. It's what this picture is. If you wanted to get a little fancier, you'd take the gas tank and move it someplace else, and you'd put another seat in the back, which was affectionately known as a mother-in-law seat. And there was another larger 5-passenger touring car, which was essentially the same size as a Model T and competed with the Model T. In about 1910, there's a company called, or a conglomerate called United States Motor Car Company. And they, along with Stoddard Dayton, started to take a look at that. In 1908, there was the International Motor Company Incorporated, and they had targeted Maxwell, Briscoe, and Buick to acquire. Well, they didn't get Buick, but they did get Maxwell, Briscoe. And then in 1910, they took those companies and merged additional companies in order to make a big, diverse company of automotive related companies. So with that, Stoddard, Dayton, Maxwell, and Courier wound up as part of the United States Motor Company. By 1911, Stoddard had 26 different models, then ranging in good range of prices. The U.S. Motor Company went into receivership in September 12. Still, car companies didn't have huge lives anyway, but and that was a lot to buy all those different companies. In January of 1913, Stoddard was bought by Maxwell, and they brought 3 Stoddard Dayton cars back into production here in Dayton. And there were plans, they actually did build some Maxwells here as well. I always think, every time I think of Maxwell, I think of Jack Benny. He drove them. Rochester drove the Maxwell for him. They were also affected by the 1913 flood, and instead of trying to rebuild things here, Maxwell moved to Detroit in 1914. Maxwell eventually would become Chrysler Corporation. There's a great story that Stoddard Dayton won the first race at Indianapolis, and it's true. Indianapolis was really a leader in automotive manufacturing around the turn of the century and the aughts and the teens. And a local group thought that the area needed a track to do testing, things like that. And as long as they had a track, they could host a race now and then. So they built a 2.5-mile oval track where the speedway is today. They paved it with gravel and tar. And that might have been a problem. The first race was in August of 1909, and we all know that in August, it's pretty darn hot in this part of the country. The first race that the Stoddard won was won by Louis Schwitzer at the rousing speed of 57 miles an hour. There's a detail, though, that is missing from all of these tales. And it is that first race was 2 laps for a total of 5 miles. But Stoddard Dayton did win the first race at the Indianapolis Speedway. Later on that day, they had the feature race, which was a 250-mile race. There were more cars. And that's where they found out that gravel and tar is not a good surface for racing. It got so hot, the cars actually tore the track up. There were accidents and crashes that killed or maimed some drivers and some spectators. After that race, Stoddard decided they were never going to do a race again. So that's the only Stoddard Dayton to win a race. But Stoddard Dayton did lead the first Indianapolis 500 because the president of the Speedway drove his Stoddard Dayton as the pace car to start the race. And so he got through the first time. He led the race that way. Those are the interesting companies, but there are a lot of interesting people too that were involved with the automotive industry. And we'll talk about a few of those. We're going to give this guy honorable mention as a Dayton influence. This is Harry Stutz. He moved to Dayton from Ansonia at 20. He started working for the Davis Sewing Machine Company in NCR, and he started tinkering. He repaired bicycles for and Milton Kepler in 1898, and he got to tinkering. So he got a farm cart and some scrap pieces, and he found a gasoline engine, and he mounted it on it, and he built what he called Old Hickory. And again, it was successful as far as it was concerned. It's kind of more like a go-kart as far as usefulness is concerned, but it was pretty successful. It was so successful that um, Kepler's decided that they wanted to get into the engine business and uh, uh, hired Stutz to work for them to do that. And Harry worked for them for quite a while before he moved to Indianapolis in 1903 and became the father of the Stutz Bearcats. So he was reasonably successful in the automotive industry, and we might as well take some responsibility for it as we got forward. I talked earlier about George Rensselaer. I probably told some of this already, but he started with $200 and turned it into an industrial business of great success. He established the Republic Motor Car Company in 1909, and they lasted until 1919. They just couldn't get past World War I. But this is the guy that was supposedly driving the Rensselaer that raised the Wright brothers flyer. Frederick Rensselaer graduated from Princeton in 1909 and joined the family business. Then he went to the Army for World War I and was assigned as a quality control engineer inspecting engines at the Wright Aeronautical Company in New Jersey. And he learned engines. He really learned engines. When he left the Army, he was convinced that aviation needed an engine that was lighter weight than these things that they were flying with. And so he started looking around for a solution. He got a friend and proposed an engine to the Navy for a high-powered air-cooled engine. With air cooling, you don't have to carry a radiator and all the coolant around. You save weight right away. And so that was the way he wanted to go. And the Navy accepted his bid, so he needed somebody to help him build it. And he found a tool company in Hartford, Connecticut called Pratt and Whitney Tool Company, and they agreed to fund the idea, and together they formed the Pratt and Whitney Aircraft Company. And Rensselaer and Meade were given controlling interest in the company. Well, the resulting engine passed qualification in 1926. That was the WASP, the Pratt and Whitney WASP, probably the most effective engine that the Army had for years and years and years. Eventually, Pratt and Whitney Tool Company wanted to divest of this engine company, and Rensselaer said, "Well, we'll take it from you, but we need to keep the name Pratt and Whitney Aircraft." And they let him do that. And eventually, Pratt and Whitney joined Vought and Boeing to form the United Aircraft and Transport Company, which beyond Vought and Boeing turned into United Airlines. Vincent Apple was a tinkerer, just like a lot of people around the turn of the century, early 1900s, here in Dayton. He formed his own company at the age of 18 to manufacture just toy electric motors. But that built out. He later organized a company called Dayton Electric and Manufacturing Company, providing ignition equipment for stationary engines. And then he developed the Magneto, which he offered for the rights for their engine. So his Magneto flew the engine in 1903. He offered it to Henry Ford, but in Henry Ford's style, Henry Ford said it's too expensive and he wouldn't buy it. So they had to go on their own. He actually provided battery timers and distributors to Stoddard. He introduced tungsten filament light bulbs, which he sold to General Electric. In 1914, he produced the starting system for Ford, improved it with a new starting system in 1916, and he just kept continuing to invent things until his death in 1932. But had a big influence on the industry. I tried. I wanted to say, well, we all know about the barn gang and we won't need to talk. You can't not talk about the barn gang if you're going to talk about Dayton's automotive history. So we're going to talk a little bit about the barn gang. We know about Deeds. We know about Kettering. Fewer people know about Bill Chris, who was the third leg of the stool in the effort. To be honest with you, I spent hours going through trying to find information about Chris, and basically what I know is he was Kettering's assistant at NCR in the inventions department. Almost nothing else, but he was really a factor in making the developments that the barn gang created come to fruition. So we're going to just talk about probably mostly about Deeds and Kettering. Deeds was the business foundation for the development effort that they had. He had an engineering degree or an engineering background. He was a brilliant guy. By 14, he had teaching certificates in a whole range of different subjects, and I don't need to review them all. But he graduated after graduating from high school. He went to Denison University, where he was the valedictorian of his class, and then he decided to go on to Cornell to get a master's degree in electrical engineering, and he ran out of money. That's probably the last time Deeds will ever run out of money. But he ran out of money and he never did complete the degree. Instead, he came to Dayton to work for the Shawn Thresher Electric Company. They built electric motors and motor accessories, things like that. And in 18 months, he was the chief engineer. So things moved quickly in those days. But there was another company down the hall from Thresher Company that kind of liked what they saw in him. And in 1899, they asked Deeds to join them to help strengthen the team. That was John Patterson and NCR. And that's when Deeds started really moving. His job at NCR was to electrify the factory and electrify their products, because Patterson was convinced that that was the way that industry needed to go. And so he became the chief development officer in construction for NCR. He built some prototypes. He proved that they were functional, but he was going to need some help. And so he contacted one of his former professors from Denison, who happened to be up at Ohio State at the time. And he said, "Can you recommend somebody to give me a hand?" And that was Charles Kettering. So that's how Kettering came here. With Kettering, took them only 3 years to electrify their machines. They were so successful, NCR opened satellite manufacturing facilities all over the world. They were also so successful that in 1913, they were convicted of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Patterson, Watson, Deeds, and several others were sentenced to 1 year somewhere. And fortunately, they were overturned on appeal. Deeds was pretty good at getting out of things like that. And I won't go into what happened in World War I. Kettering is an interesting guy. I love the things he said. And so we're going to talk a lot about little quotes from Charles Kettering. This one, people think of the inventor as a screwball, but no one asks the inventor what he thinks of other people. That was Kettering's sense of humor. So he was doing that while he was inventing all sorts of things. He had more than 300 patents himself. That says it all. I don't even have to read that one. And like I say, I love his quote. So you have to bear with me from it. It's not a disgrace to fail. Failing is one of the greatest arts in the world. Thomas Edison felt the same way. You know, he said invention is what 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. The same kind of thing. You keep working until you get it done. Kettering also said one time, he said, if you're just a regular person and you succeed 99 times out of 100, because of that one time you failed, you're a failure. If you're an inventor and you fail 99 times out of 100, but you succeed once, you're a brilliant man. And he really worked on that. One fails forward to success. We learn from our failures. The only time you mustn't fail is the last time you try. If you've succeeded, go. Better is the enemy of good enough, as a matter of fact. A problem well stated is a problem half solved, and I've seen that in my life a lot of times. If you want to kill any idea in the world, get a committee. And this one too I love this one. When I was research head at General Motors and wanted a problem solved, I'd place a table outside the meeting room with a sign, "Leave slide rules here." If I didn't do that, I'd find some engineer reaching for his slide rule. Then he'd be on his feet saying, "Boss, you can't do that." Kettering didn't accept that logic. As they worked together at NCR, they became very, very good friends. And as it turned out, Kettering also had a kind of a rural background in his youth. And so they had common backgrounds where they could relate to each other, but their interests were complementary instead of, on the same line all the time. Deeds was really into the business side, although he had a technical understanding. Kettering was really into the invention side, but he knew he had to have a business friend to keep him online. So they worked really well together. And as things went on, Deeds noticed this automotive thing going on, and he thought there's got to be an opportunity for economic growth in the automotive business, but it needed to be more practical. The car still wasn't all that practical. So he started looking. The gasoline engine was really the most reliable of the engines and motive forces, but they weren't reliable at all, and they were hard to operate. A lot of people felt that electric was the best solution, but he just wasn't convinced of that. So he thought, well, maybe we could build a car ourselves and do it right, but he didn't have the resources to do it, so he tried to go on, but he wanted to be involved in the automotive industry. And he would bounce those ideas across with Kettering. He wanted to put something on motor cars. But in order to improve a car, it was his opinion, he needed to really know them. And so he needed a car, and he had two choices. He could buy one or he could build one. And so he built one. This is the Suburban 60. It became Deeds' car. He built it himself. And it went on to have a lot of influence in the development of the products that Delco created. And Deeds also felt that men must hunt in pairs, and so he didn't want to do this himself. He wanted to do it with somebody else. Kettering was the perfect guy for that. And he told Kettering what he was thinking. If they could combine each other's talents and efforts, they could be successful. And Kettering's response was, "That suits me, we'll shake on it." That's really key, because the most important agreement in the automotive industry, as far as I'm concerned, was done by a handshake. That's all they had. They didn't have a contract. They just shook hands and went on to go. So the kit for the Suburban 60 was delivered to Deeds, and he took it back to his barn. The original equipment that came had a 2-speed axle, which Deeds didn't like, so he built one to his satisfaction, a new transmission. But NCR still required most of his time. He and Kettering were both full-time employees of NCR, so they had to do all of this on off times, evenings, weekends. So there was no rest. They worked hard on this. And then they came up with the something. This is a schematic of a magneto. And original gasoline engines were powered, or got their power from a magneto, the power to create the spark. The magneto works by that magnetic rotor there turning with the engine. And as the as the rotor turns, it creates an electrical current in a winding, and that gets boosted so that it has enough power to create a spark, and you get your ignition. But there are some drawbacks to a magneto. Number one, they only produce power relative to the speed of the engine. So if you were at idle, you might not be making enough power to get a spark, and your engine would stop. And then you'd have to get out and crank it again. And if you had to crank it fast enough to get the spark to happen, and that was a real problem. And you had to have a spark or a crank in order to start the engine. There was no battery. There was nothing to cause the engine to turn over. But as they were talking about it, this is Kettering's original artwork. It was not quite as clean as that schematic, but this is the schematic of a spark-based ignition system with a battery. So there was a spark control in it. They could control the spark. They could get consistent spark power with it. So it was simpler, it was safer, and way more reliable to run than the magneto. So they started working on it in the barn, and it worked. So unfortunately, Kettering didn't get to fail, but the ignition system worked. Well, they were able to get started building this and making it producible because they had all kinds of equipment in the barn from building the Suburban 60. And so they turned the barn into, they turned the barn into their factory. But NCR still was an issue. They knew that they had to keep working for NCR, or one of them did. But by 1909, it became clear Kettering needed to concentrate on the ignition system. So he left NCR. And when he left NCR, Christ took his place at NCR. But Christ was still working with Deeds and Kettering on the other thing. Deeds stayed at NCR as well. So they got a product. Now they were able to take the system to Henry Leland, who at the time was the president of Cadillac. He had an engineering background. He understood what they were talking about. He was frustrated with the magneto, didn't like it either. So they came to him with a solution to that. And so he sent their chief engineer to Dayton to take a look at what they had. Now, the train ride from Detroit to Dayton is a few hours, but you could get on the train in the morning, get down here, visit for a couple of hours, and get on the train and get back. And that's what this chief engineer was going to do. Deeds and Kettering met him at the railway station. They got in Kettering's Cadillac, which was equipped with the ignition system. It was convenient. It was a Cadillac, I think. But and they drove around town. And it was great. It was successful. It was smooth. It worked exactly the way they wanted it to. So the chief engineer went back to the station. He was impressed. When Kettering and Deeds went back to the car to go home, the car wouldn't start. Timing is everything. So they sent an ignition set to Detroit for testing, and Leland approved on it. They negotiated 5,000 sets in late 1909 for the 1910 production. Now, they didn't have anybody to build this thing yet. They certainly didn't have production capability for 5,000 sets. So they had work to do. Things do happen more quickly, though, in 1909. They found a manufacturer in Indiana, and the rest they could develop until they could do it themselves. So now they had a contract, a product, a manufacturer, but there was one other thing they were missing. They weren't really a company. They didn't have a corporate identity. So now they've got to come up with a company name. Deed suggested a name called the Dayton Laboratories and Engineering Company, and Kettering, talking to Chris, said what he thought, and Chris' comment was, nah, not so good. And Chris came up with the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, Delco, and they agreed. So with $150,000 worth of capital stock, they split 50-50 between Deeds and Kettering, and now Delco is a company. But Murphy's Law continues. And I'm a real believer in Murphy's Law. They've sent the first sets of ignition systems to Cadillac, and not very long after that, Leland was in touch with them saying that they weren't working right. The controlling relays were sticking, and the controlling relay was the heart of the system. So they had to find a way to solve it. Kettering got on the train up to Detroit, picked up started taking a look at it. Got on the midnight train back, so it was very dark in the train. But while he was on the train, he had his hand in a bag with the relays, and just by feel, he could tell that the relays hadn't been machined properly. And so what he did was, as soon as he got off the train in Dayton in the morning, headed for the barn and started fixing the machining errors on it, and turned around and went back to Detroit with the repaired relays. He had to do that because Leland had already advertised that he was going to have this new system in their 1910 models, and so he had to do something pretty quickly. So the problem was solved, kind of. The next problem was there was some issues with the coil. So Kettering's up to Detroit and back again with coils. And they started taking a look at it. I call this miracle number 2 because of what happened. They were working so hard to solve the problem with the coil. It was days and nights and all sorts of things. And it got to the point where Kettering's eyesight was starting to be affected. When Kettering was young, he developed a problem with his eyesight. And to the effect, he had to wear very strong glasses. And when he got stressed, sometimes it would get worse. And they were afraid that it was getting so bad under all this stress that it might cause permanent damage. So they sent him home, and fortunately he recovered. That's the miracle. So they solved that. Well, now that they got that solved, what else are they going to do? What's next? And so Leland kind of gave him the push on this one. He hated the crank. The crank was just terrible. It was dangerous. Here you see he saw 6 workmen with broken arms because the crank's backing up on him. He was on another drive in Detroit with another business executive, when they came across a guy in a car that had stalled, and he was having a terrible time getting the car cranked. So the other executive got out to give him a hand. The crank went back and hit him in the head, and a couple of days later, he died. So the crank was a problem, obviously, and there had to be a way to solve that. What can be done? When Kettering suggested an electric starter, and it's not that much different than electrifying a cash register. They used to have to turn the crank to make the cash register, right? Same kind of thing. It's probably a little easier to do a cash register, and Leland said, well, that's great. You know what? If you can do that, I'll put it in my 1912 car. You'd still have to work fast. It was 1910. So back to the barn. And Kettering went back to Dayton with a Cadillac engine. They were able to rig a prototype up almost that day and hooked it up, and it worked. Now they needed to make it producible, but at least they knew the concept was good. You could get a motor and it could turn over an engine and get it to start. And that there was more to it than that, because the starter motor could also generate power, recharge the battery, and provide power to the lights. So now you've got safety from the starting capability, you got safety from the lights, you've got reliability from being able to charge your battery. What a great thing. So Leland was happy. Yeah, but Murphy returned. Leland sent a Cadillac down for them to mount the starter on the Cadillac engine. There was a problem. It didn't fit. And as they looked at it, they found that the Cadillac engineers didn't leave enough room for the starter under the hood. So they had to maneuver some things around, change some drawings, and they were able to get it to work. About that time, Kettering was involved in an accident and he broke his ankle. And in those days, when you break an ankle, you get casted, and then you're told to sit in bed for 2 weeks, not do anything with it on it. And so he was going to obey. But the next day, another call from Cadillac, and accidentally, the only Cadillac with a new starter motor was in Leland's garage, and the garage caught fire. So Kettering's 2 weeks in bed lasted about a day. He was on the train back up to Detroit, needed to fix it. So there's a picture of him with crutches on the floor and his casted foot sticking out from under the car. But he fixed the starter. So now they've got the starter, but they've got to get batteries. And they wrote a specification for batteries and sent it out to the battery manufacturers, and nobody was interested in this cockamamie scheme that they had. So they said, well, not really. The only one that gave them a little bit of a response was the electric storage battery company that were familiar with Exide batteries. That it was the manufacturer of those. They had a Cleveland office, so they sent one of their people from Cleveland down to take a look at what was going on with this Delco outfit. And the salesman shows up at the barn, and he says, see some guy, baseball cap, kind of thin, tall guy, baseball cap. He's got his feet up on the desk, kind of sitting easy, and walks into the office and says, I'm looking for a man named Kettering who thinks he wants to buy 5,000 batteries from us. And so the lanky guy stood up and said, I'm Kettering. And he took him around and showed him the factory. And the salesman convinced the company to go ahead and build the batteries. They came back with a battery that was way too big, so they had to go back again and try. But they found a battery that worked quite well. But now time's an issue. Leland wanted to see how the whole thing worked before he left on vacation. Sure. Probably, yeah, I would think so, because 12s didn't come into use until quite a while later. Leland wanted to test it before he left on vacation, but of course things happened fast because he was leaving in 3 days. So they started prepping the starter for delivery, and it just did not work. They spent 2 solid days trying to troubleshoot it. They couldn't find the answer to the problem, and they were going crazy again. Finally, they called Chris at NCR and said, look, we need you to come on over here and help us out with this thing. And Chris got to the barn, sent most of the guys home because he could tell they were just shot. And he took this starter apart, and he just found 2 wires connected wrong, connected them right, and he's done. He's got it. And they expressed the starter to Detroit. And this is the result. This is the famous advertisement for Cadillac, the car that has no crank. They made the schedule. I'm going to kind of hit my hour, but I'm going to keep on going if you don't mind. They told me I was going to run over. Let's take a little look at Chrysler. Chrysler's engineers started to notice that as aircraft got more and more sophisticated, they got more streamlined, You look at a bird and how streamlined it is, and they thought, maybe a streamlined car body would give you better performance. Then they got to go ahead to take a look at it, and they thought, well, let's see who can help us out on this. We probably would want to run some wind tunnel tests, and so they found one guy that was pretty experienced in wind tunnels. So Orville got involved with his tunnel experience, and what they came up with, of course, was the Chrysler Airflow. In 1934, the car was introduced. It was really a radical design. It was streamlined. It did everything technically that they wanted it to do, but it was an absolute commercial flop. It was the ugliest car anybody had ever seen in their life, because they expected to see these boxy radiators and all that stuff, and this is definitely not that. So it did not do well, but it really influenced eventually automotive design. The Mustang. There's actually two people involved in the Mustang development. We know about what's his name, Gary. I'll talk about him in a little while. But there's also Donald Fry, who has a little bit of a connection to Dayton as well. He was the one that worked with Lee Iacocca to actually bring it to production. It's a great story too of how it was done. He was born in St. Louis, lived in Iowa for a while, but he got his high school diploma from Bethel High School in Miami County. Went to engineering school. World War II, he worked on the Packard version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He, after the war, got his degrees and joined Ford in 1950 in the metallurgy department, and eventually became vice president and chief engineer. He was involved with the Ford Falcon. This is the review his children gave him about the Ford Falcon. I clearly remember sitting around the dining room table and my kids saying, "Dad, your cars stink. They're terrible. There's no pizzazz." Well, the Falcon is actually the foundation for the Mustang. The Mustang was built on the platform that the Falcon came from. So they did a pretty good job with it, I think. Fry pursued the Mustang after Henry Ford had rejected it 4 times. Ford was just terrified of another Edsel. And so he kept saying no. He didn't want to introduce another car. But every once in a while, Iacocca would say, "Why don't you go over here and try this and do that and tinker with this?" So that, like, basically, as they said, the whole project was bootlegged and there was no official approval. It had to do it on a shoestring. When Ford finally found out about it and approved the project, he put Fry in charge and told him if it was a failure, he was fired. Seems to have done okay. The other guy, Gail Halderman. Gail was a student at the Dayton Art Institute in design. When he left the Art Institute, he was offered a job at Ford in their design studio. He worked on retractable hoods or hardtops. He was involved with the Falcon and the Thunderbird, and he was selected then to go home, one of 4 people to propose a design for this new car. It was to be a competitor with a Corvair Monza. And so he went home, and the next day he came back with this sketch. And it's so much a Mustang already that it's unbelievable, I think. He just did it on his porch. So you can see the Mustang in there. At the time, they used a code name for it, the Ford Cougar, and you can see this picture here where there's a Cougar where the Mustang belongs on the grill. In '68, Bunky Knudsen and Larry Shinoda joined Ford from General Motors. and they were ace designers for General Motors. They knew their business really well, but they didn't necessarily know Ford's business very well in the way Ford did things. But they started leading design efforts. This would have been probably for the '69 Mustang model year. But Knudsen and Iacocca had two different ideas of what this car was supposed to look like. And in order to keep the project going, Halderman and his team actually built a car that had looked different on each side. One that Iacocca would like and one that Knudsen would like. And fortunately, as I say, they never visited the studio at the same time. So they got almost the end. You got to include the soapbox derby if you're going to talk about cars. Dayton Daily News photographer Myron Scott was taking pictures around Burkhardt Street in Dayton in 1933, and he saw some kids basically taking soapboxes with wheels stuck on them and riding down the hill there at Burkhardt Street, and they were having a heck of a time. They were just having a good time. So he took some pictures of them, and he got to talking with them, and he said, if you bring some more of your friends back next week, we'll take some more pictures. And so they showed up with, instead of 3 kids, 19 kids showed up, and friends to watch. By 1933, with Dayton Daily News sponsoring the Soapbox Derby, there were 325 entries, and they had a crowd of 40,000 lining Burkhardt Street. In a couple of years, it was even worse than that. There were about 60,000. And as a result of that, it was finally decided that it was too big for the streets of Dayton. They moved it for a couple of years over to Wright-Patterson and ran it down the hill on the strip there over near the Air Force Museum. And then finally went to Akron for Derby Downs, which is a really neat place if you've ever had a chance to see it. It's still in use, and it's just really cool. The first winner was an Oakwood High School student. So I'm proud to be here to say. Scott has one other claim to fame in the automotive industry. He's the one that named the Corvette. So I'm not too bad. I'm less than 10 minutes over. Does anyone have questions?